What's up, BookTube? Sandy Golson back here with my November reading wrap-up for 2020. And because I was participating in National Novel Writing Month, NaNoWriMo, I did not get in as much reading as I had hoped to, but I was still able to get in some reading. Now, for the reading, I went into the month with the decision that I was going to participate in the unofficial nonfiction November, and so I did do that, and most of the books, as you will see, are nonfiction books on this list. There is one fiction exception, and yet the books that I read were very powerful, touched on different topics, and were very important, either because of current times or because of historic interest for at least two of the books that I'm going to talk about today. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. Book number one on the list for me is 40 Minutes of Hell, The Extraordinary Life of Nolan Richardson by Russ Bradford. The New York Times on the front cover, highly provocative, a sharp-elbowed biography. Now, before I jump into why this book was interesting to me, I'm going to read the back cover so you get a little bit of an idea, a quick snapshot of Coach Nolan Richardson. Born in El Paso's Segundo Barrio, Nolan Richardson was the first black star for legendary basketball coach Don Haskins at Texas Western College. Rising to national prominence at the University of Arkansas, Richardson became the first black coach at a Southern school to win the NCAA championship, playing an electrifying style dubbed 40 Minutes of Hell. His outspoken response to perceived racial injustices culminated in Richardson's accusing his university of discrimination, bringing about an abrupt end to his college career. The only coach in history to win a junior college, NIT, and NCAA title, Richardson now coaches in the WNBA. Well, that was at the time of this book being written. Russ Bradford, a former assistant coach under Don Haskins, highlights Richardson's trailblazing career with empathy and intimacy, revealing a man whose hard-won successes were matched by deeply felt losses. An inside look at the politics of race in college sports, 40 Minutes of Hell sets Richardson's complex story against the backdrop of a decisive time in American history. And the personal losses, he suffered a very personal loss of a family member that really significantly impacted him, and he went through some racial challenges just because of his outspoken nature and because of some of the trailblazing that he was doing, some of the doors that he was breaking down, and the product of the times that he was born and grew up in. And so Nolan Richardson is a tremendously complex figure, just revered by many people, and the picture of controversy in the minds of other people, which again just kind of reflects that complexity of Coach Richardson. But I was really excited to read this. I of course watched Coach Richardson and his teams, mainly his Arkansas teams that were very successful in the 90s, and they mentioned the national championship, the NCAA national championship, and that was pretty impressive. And so I was really interested in kind of those parts, and some of the other parts I kind of skimmed, but I was really interested in his background growing up and what helped mold him into the person that he was. And then I was interested in some of the behind the scenes stuff and the tremendous politics that are the product of race in the workplace, and some of the things that Coach Richardson had to deal with. So I was really fascinated to read those parts of the book. So I don't know, it might not be a good read for everybody else, but for me, it was very interesting. 40 Minutes of Hell, Russ Bradford's take on the legendary career of Coach Nolan Richardson. Next up is a book by Michael Eric Dyson, a fellow Detroiter, and like myself. And this book talks about the extraordinary life of Dr. Martin Luther King. And the book is entitled, the title of the book reflects my favorite speech by Dr. Martin Luther King, the last speech he ever gave. I may not get there with you, the true Martin Luther King Jr. And on the front cover, Robert Boynton from the New York Times, Dyson gives us a thorough contemporary king, an enigmatic hero whose flaws and failings make him more, not less relevant to our times. On the back cover, it's titled "The Martin Luther King Jr. We Forgotten." A private citizen who transformed the world around him, Martin Luther King Jr. was arguably the greatest American who ever lived. Now, after more than 30 years, few people understand how truly radical he was. In this groundbreaking examination of the man and his legacy, provocative author, lecturer, and professor Michael Eric Dyson restores King's true vitality and complexity and challenges us to embrace the very contradictions that make King relevant in today's world. And so, and I think he says it at the beginning of this book, and people are probably looking and say, oh, really, another book about Martin Luther King? But this one really goes into some depth, and it really talks about the complexity of King and how we look at him now a certain way, and we don't look at him as being radical as he was in his day, in the 1960s, when he really rose to prominence, and how radical, frankly, he would be considered if he was alive today. And I often wonder, like, how would Martin Luther King be perceived if he was alive today in these times with social media and the polarization that we see around the country? How would he be perceived today? Because Martin Luther King is not quite as simple as "I have a dream," which is what everybody says, that one day. He was much more complex than that. And frankly, he was much more radical than that. And the word radical now is thrown around as an attack word by a lot of people. And so it makes you wonder how King would be perceived were he alive today. So this is a great book by Michael Eric Dyson. I really appreciated it. I read it really fast. There were some portions that I skimmed because I was a little bit more familiar with it, and I was trying to focus on either things that I was not quite as familiar with Martin Luther King, or topics that I was familiar with but was particularly interested in maybe learning a little bit more. So just a really strong book. Michael Eric Dyson, tremendously thorough in this book, and I really enjoyed this portrayal of what Martin Luther King really was, as opposed to the modern Martin Luther King that many of us are accustomed to hearing about, and that we have come to believe through years of almost like a social conditioning. This tells you a little bit more about the real Martin Luther King, complexities and all. Okay, next up is going to be a book that's going to be controversial to some people, because this is an individual that, a historical individual that's always fascinated me, and I've always been curious to learn more about him. And that personality, that person is Woody Hayes, the legendary head coach for many years at the Ohio State University. And the book that I read was A Fire to Win: The Life and Times of Woody Hayes by John Lombardo. And this is a book that I started many years ago, and I read, and I was a kid, really young kid, not really knowing anything about football when Woody Hayes infamously ended his college football career with the punch that he threw at a Clemson player in the Gator Bowl in, I think it was in the late 1970s. I was always been fascinated by Woody Hayes. I read a book by Michael Rosenberg, and it was about the football rivalry between University of Michigan coach Bo Schembechler and Ohio State coach Woody Hayes. And it was a fascinating read to learn a little bit more about the rivalry. And then as I was reading it, I already knew a lot about Bo Schembechler. I've read a lot about Bo Schembechler from Michigan. Growing up being a Michigan fan, I knew a lot about Bo. And yet I was kind of curious about Woody Hayes. And as I started to read this book, I read the back cover of this book, and I was stunned. I did not realize that Woody Hayes had been as successful as he had been. So let me just read a little bit from the back cover so you get an idea. Woody Hayes was one of the greatest football coaches in history and one of the most fascinating. The former history teacher ran his football empire as an absolute monarchy, but had a surprisingly altruistic side hidden from the public. Author John Lombardo uses his extensive sports writing experience to craft an accurate portrait of one of the most riveting figures in football. First and foremost, Woody Hayes was a coach, and the achievements are stunning. While at Ohio State, he won 5 national titles and 13 Big Ten Conference championships, made 8 Rose Bowl appearances, and earned 2 National Coach of the Year awards. Moreover, Hayes' lifetime coaching record, 238 wins, 72 losses, and 10 ties, puts him in the first rank of college coaching immortals. No other coach has won more games in a shorter period. Countless interviews of former players, assistant coaches, and friends shaped the image of Hayes and his career, which spanned the mid-1940s to the late 1970s during a tremendous period of change in American society. A Fire to Win is an honest and revealing biography of Hayes, a man who ranks in the pantheon of football coaches. And so Hayes was he was a volatile figure, and you can go and search for him on YouTube and you'll see some of the stuff that he got into. And he was fiery. He spoke his mind, and he got into a lot of confrontations, and he certainly ran things his way. As Frank Sinatra would say, he did it his way. And so it was really a fascinating read to get an inside look at Hayes and what he did and what he accomplished, and how sort of the rise and the fall of Woody Hayes was really fascinating, and just really a comprehensive book, just a great story. And okay, I'm not really an Ohio State fan, of course, as many of you know, but this was a fascinating look at Woody Hayes, who, as controversial as he was, certainly was an interesting figure. And the inner historian right here just can't resist reading about important figures, whether they're figures that I would have rooted for or not. Next up in the nonfiction range is Wounds. This is a story that's a little bit more personal to me because I'm familiar. I know the authors, and so I was really curious to read this. Rajel Jones and Daniel Abbott. Wounds is a collaborative memoir in stories. And so let me read a little bit from the back cover just to give you a feel for what this particular book was about. In an age when discussions about race and privilege seem to inevitably escalate into us versus them tribalism, Rajel and Daniel model for us what it looks like to engage in culturally intelligent dialogue, perspective taking, and friendship. Their rich, honest narratives are rich with lessons for all of us in how to create a more culturally intelligent world, wrote David Livermore, PhD, author of Driven by Differences and The Curious Traveler. Also, Wounds is a must-read for every American of color. Rajel Jones, a black man, and Daniel Abbott, a white man, share their stories of race, family, resistance, loss, violence, overcoming, and love with astonishing grace and candor. Whether it's Abbott's exhorting white Americans that they can no longer look away from our nation's systemic racism, or Jones insisting that beauty and righteousness reside not in our similarities, but our differences. This book is both a clear-eyed testament and a call to action written by two brothers who know what of they speak. If we allow it, if we don't look away, Wounds is a book that will heal us. That is Connie Mae Fowler, author of Before Women Had Wings. And so this book is it's a fast read, it's a powerful read, and you can see I ordered from the publisher directly and ended up with an autographed copy of this particular book. These are important stories about the complexities of race, and giving you great context to understand these complexities a little bit better, along with the call to action that we can't just always sit on the sidelines and let other people do the work or hope that other people will do the work. We have to all be active in changing the world around us. And so it was riveting because I'm familiar with the settings that they're speaking about in the book, and I'm familiar with both of them. And yet I still learned a lot about both of them and their journeys to get to where they are today. And so this was definitely a powerful read. It was an important read, and you don't have to know these individuals to be able to relate to the stories that they're trying to tell and the lessons that they're trying to teach through their own life experiences. So I would encourage you to read Wounds by Daniel Abbott and Rajel Jones. And finally, my fiction book of the month is Firestarter by Stephen King. I read this book in a couple of different ways. I read it through the physical copy of the book, of course, and I also read from the online copy of the book, the sort of Kindle book, and then I also listened via audiobook, that I was able to find the audiobook online. So this is a book that I've always wanted to read. I've seen bits and pieces of the movie with Drew Barrymore, but I have never actually read the book until now. And I wanted to read the book before really sitting down and watching the movie, because the movie became available as part of a subscription that I have. And so before I watched the movie, I wanted to see the story that the book told first. And so it was a fun read. It was it's a long read, and at times maybe a little bit repetitive, and maybe a little bit slow moving, but it was a really interesting story, and it was every bit as interesting as I thought it was going to be, and I was definitely glad I read it. Again, this is older Stephen King, and I've read a lot of older Stephen King over the years, and a lot of his older stuff is probably some of his best stuff for a lot of people. Maybe some of his scarier stuff. But I tell you, I really enjoyed reading it. I'm glad I did. It's a Stephen King classic. And now I'm looking forward to actually watching the movie and then being able to kind of compare and contrast the movie to the book. All right, so there you have it, my reads for the month of November 2020. Mostly nonfiction, but a little bit of fiction. I slipped in that Stephen King book, Firestarter, to kind of round out my reading for the month. Very interesting books, touching on different topics, historical type books, books about culture and race. And it really was just fun to just read just different types of books. And nonfiction books I tend to read a little bit faster, and yet I want to make sure that it all soaks in. So had a really productive month of reading for November, and I'm excited about what's to come in December. So thank you for coming and watching this video. If you could hit the like button on the way out. If you like BookTube and AuthorTube content, then please consider hitting the subscribe button and staying tuned for future content on this channel.